to welcome everybody to our 107th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Benji Cohn, and I am a trout angler also, so this is kind of a fun topic for me. I always get excited this time of year to get out and explore some streams across the Midwest and the driftless area. And we got Dusty Hoffman with us today to talk about stream easements, which if you fished anywhere across the United States, Minnesota is pretty special in the amount of stream easements we have and opportunities we have to get out there and access water. So I think with that, Dusty, I'll turn it over to you and take it away.
All righty, thank you, Benji. So my name is Dustin Hoffman, and I'm a stream habitat specialist for the DNR, and I work out of Lanesboro, Minnesota. Today we're gonna go over a presentation I've prepared for you all about trout stream easements and improved angling opportunities on habitat improvement projects. So some of the topics that we're going to talk about today are just a basic overview on easements, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about how to properly use an easement and different ways that you can find where you can locate easements, whether they be an angling easement or a different type. And then we're going to also talk about the right angling opportunities for you based on an easement or other public lands. Then we're going to transition over into some habitat improvement discussion, and we'll talk about the benefits of habitat improvement projects. We're going to feature a few of the northern projects, a few of the southern projects in the driftless area, and then I'm going to end this presentation with some tips for trout fishing. So I'm trying to keep you all engaged until the very end. So just a broad overview on easements. If you're focusing on the program of easements within the DNR itself, the DNR kind of has a mission statement for easements. And that mission statement is the DNR purchases land and interest in lands to protect, conserve, improve, consolidate, and expand recreational and natural resource opportunities throughout the state. Now, the DNR has several different types of easements, but we're going to focus a little bit more on angling easements today. And there are over 500 miles of angling easements throughout the state of Minnesota. When a landowner reaches out to the Minnesota DNR to have an easement sold on their property, the DNR is only able to pay them a fair market value. So there's not really any negotiations when easements are sold, but when an easement is sold, it's sold in perpetuity. Typically, an angling easement would be about 66 feet wide. The proper way to use angling easements is during the angling season. So for trout fishing, this means that you are not able to use easements on trout streams during the closed part of the season, which is from October 15th until January 1st. So some things that we definitely don't want to do on easements are litter or damage the property of the landowner. The easement is typically just owned in the management rights by the DNR. That landowner still owns the property. Some other uses that we don't have the ability to partake in on a landowner's property and on an angling easement are hiking, harvesting mushrooms and wild edibles, or hunting. We also cannot bring dogs, and we should never attempt to pet livestock. These are some of the things that the conservation officers will most often hear about as complaints from landowners that have an easement on their property. So how do you find the angling easements? The DNR does have an online resource for you. There's a website that if you go to the DNR website, you can basically type in some keywords that will help you get to the trout fishing page for Minnesota. And as you can see in this photo on the slide, there's a little search bar up in the upper right corner. If you type trout fishing or trout finder up into that search bar and press enter, you'll come up with links that will bring you to this page. I'm going to walk you through what you do next on this page. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that you have options to select an area of interest. So for the example of this presentation, we're going to stick to the northeast part of the state for walking you through an example of what you see next. The next page that comes up is this page, and you can see that you can either search by map, by lake, or by streams. So we're going to walk through how to search by a map. That way you can see the broad area of the area that you would choose to be fishing. But if you have a stream specifically that you want to search out in that region, if you already know ahead of time, and you want to just search to see if regulations have changed or easements have been added, you can search that stream very easily through the stream section. So looking at the map section, you can see that we have the legend is in the top of this picture. And in that legend, you can see that we have a lot of different representations in that legend on this map photo. And one of the ones that I'll point out is that we're looking at the Stewart River AMA. And if you look at the lower part of the Stewart River before it drains into the lake, which on this photo actually looks like a gray blob in the lower right corner, you can see that there's purple around the stream or the river. And that purple indicates that there is an easement. Now, if you want to use a different map layout, you can, in the bottom left corner, you can change to a different map layout, which will look more like this. And you can also use the feature to get more information just by clicking on the river. And in this example here, we can see that from downstream of County Road 2 is where this special regulation applies. So you can also see the length of the special regulation. And on this slide, it says 2.6 miles or 2.16 miles. So sometimes it's important to know what kind of topography or land cover type is around the water that you're fishing. If you were seeing a bunch of farm fields and it were near a rain event, you might be a little bit more cautious about choosing that place to go fishing because there could be sediment runoff and muddy water. In a more forested area, you probably have less sedimentation going on. So there are other ways to find these easements, and the Minnesota DNR has a history of putting out these books that you can see in the left photo on this slide. There's a book for the southern and central part of Minnesota, and then there's a book for the northeast part of Minnesota. And these are like the holy grail of trout fishing maps that you can find for Minnesota. And if you don't find one of these at one of your local fisheries offices, you can actually call the DNR Info Center, and that phone number is on this slide, but Benji will post that in the comments as well. And they can send that book to you. An example of what you'll find in that book is on the picture on the right. So the photo on the right actually shows Trout Run Creek, and there's a couple things I want to point out about Trout Run Creek in this photo. For one, you can see that the stream is actually represented in a yellow color, and that yellow color is attached to a certain protection slot limit for trout on that stream. And that's a protected slot limit of 12 to 16-inch fish. So those fish have to be returned to the stream. Another regulation to this special regulation is that you can only use artificial lures or flies on this stream. So you cannot use bait. Now, if you look in that legend, you can see right underneath the yellow line that there's a little teal colored line. That is a stream with the same protected slot limit of 12 to 16 inches, but you can use bait on that stream. So there are a variety of uses that you can find within special regulations. So it's good to just double check on those all the time. Another bit about easements is that there are different types of easements. We have aquatic management units, and in this photo on the right, I'm pointing out with that large arrow the Etna Creek AMA, which is the aquatic management unit. I'm sorry, the aquatic management area. And so that is a unit of land or an acreage of land. The gray that surrounds the stream just to the north of that AMA is actually just a regular AMA and angling easement. So that's what you see along, like you saw on the previous slide for Trout Run Creek. Those are just angling easements as opposed to an AMA like this Etna Creek example is. An AMA like Etna Creek is actually owned in fee title, which means that the DNR owns the actual land. So a regular angling easement, which we see just north of that AMA, that's actually just the DNR just owns the management rights to that property. So that does restrict a landowner from just doing anything they want within the AMA. So the DNR asks if they will just, report if they're going to be cutting trees or if they're going to be mowing. But the management ownership gives the DNR a lot of rights to be able to do habitat improvement projects and access, so they can do surveys or they can just simply do inspections in easements. Another type of easement that we have is indicated right below the arrow in this photo on the right at Larson Creek. This is a walk-in easement. Walk-in easements are basically a 16-foot wide easement that gives the DNR and the public access to another easement type. So on this walk-in easement, we're getting access to the stream for an angling easement. And that angling easement is owned in perpetuity, meaning permanently. You cannot actually buy your easement back from the DNR. And that is a question that we get often. So what happens when there is no easement? Now what? Well, the best thing you can do is knock on a landowner's door and ask permission. When I talk with the conservation officers, they always advise that we ask permission first. Don't go out and fish and, pretend you didn't know you needed to ask permission when there's not an easement. Oftentimes you'll go and ask a landowner and they'll say yes, and quite often I've actually been thanked by a landowner for asking before just going out there and helping myself. So a thing that we can do to really improve relationships among landowners and anglers is just be courteous and knock. Some other ways that you can find angling opportunities, and maybe these are a way that are a little bit more in sync with the way that you like to fish, are looking for other public lands. So the photos on this slide are actually showing you some public lands in a few different colors. We have represented on the left photo, Trout Run Creek that is flowing through a state park area. That's actually the Whitewater State Park. So that blue is state park, and adjacent to that, you see kind of a yellowish tannish color. That is the Whitewater Wildlife Management Area. Those wildlife management areas are public lands as well. There are some restrictions in areas of the WMA or the Wildlife Management Area, but typically there is not a restriction for angling. On the photo on the right, you can see that we have some greenish color around the stream, and that's representing state forest lands. So Gribbon Creek, the stream that has a yellow color indication, that flows through that state forest land. It also has some easement. When you look toward the bottom of the picture, you can see, and I hope that it's large enough for you to see this, but there is some gray along the stream as well, where you have state forest on one side of the stream, and then you have easement on the other side of the stream. So we have many miles of access through WMAs, state parks, and state forest lands as well. Don't just look for the easements to fish. Just a couple scenic highlights from the North Shore easements. We have photos of the Baptism River and the Beaver River. These are both sites that are owned by the public because they're on a public angling easement. We also have a couple sites from down in the southern part of the state in the driftless area, where we have a lot of limestone rock outcroppings and very healthy trout populations. So the DNR owning easements is great for the public because we have an opportunity through those easements. But it's also great for the public in that the DNR then has the ability to do habitat improvement projects. So a lot of the funding that goes into habitat improvement projects comes from one resource in the state of Minnesota, largely, and that is the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. The funds typically channel to the DNR through the Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council, and there are several proposals that come in every year. The funding that's generated through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment is actually a 0.3% sales tax that Minnesotans voted upon themselves in 2009. Some of the benefits of that Lessard Sam's Outdoor Heritage Council and the Clean Water funds are all of the projects that you see in this map here. These are sites where Trout Unlimited has partnered up with the Minnesota DNR and sometimes other partners, such as the National Resource Conservation Service and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. But Minnesota Trout Unlimited has brought up to the Lessard Council their proposal to do restoration work on all of these project sites. The little red dots are in-stream work, which is where you see like a full-scale habitat improvement project on a stream. And the little green dots are representing places where we did invasive tree and brush removal. So some of the benefits of habitat improvement projects for wildlife are that we have more stabilized soils. So there's less sedimentation and soil washing into the streams from high banks that erode during high water events. A lot of these projects will not only enhance, the stability of the soils, but they'll provide a variety of habitat types. And some of those habitat types are going to provide overhead cover. Some of them are going to stabilize a riffle. So we have maybe a better feeding area for trout because we then increase the amount of gravelly substrate as opposed to sediment and sand and silt that would bury gravel. By exposing gravel, we are going to have a better variety of homes for insect life, which in turn typically result in a larger trout population and a healthier trout population. We're also providing hiding places and spawning habitat. When we expose gravel, we're exposing spawning habitat for trout. But we're also building in long-term resiliency and sustainability. So something about sustainability and resiliency is that the future with climate change and the way that infrastructure is just kind of spanning across the countryside is that we're going to be faced with a lot more bridges, culverts, dams, and sometimes those act as a fish barrier. So in this habitat improvement project up in the north at Tisher Creek, you can see on the left photo that there's a little bit of a plunge from the water, like going through that culvert, and then it has a drop before it actually gets to the bed elevation. That is a barrier not only to fish, but other aquatic organisms like invertebrates, which are the insects, and then also, turtles and frogs, they would also be blocked by those types of barriers at times. The photo on the right side shows after the habitat improvement project came through and actually made more of like a natural channel bottom and passageway for fish and other organisms. At Chester Creek up north, there was a long sediment-filled pool that you can see in the photo on the left. And the photo on the right side, you should be able to see that there are several different pools, and they're broken up by rocks that kind of span across the channel. Another thing to note here is that they're actually changing some of the riparian area, which is the area just outside of the water. And in that photo on the right, you can see that they added some species of trees that were native to the area and that will help hold in soils, but also help with flooding so that, you have logs and other debris getting trapped by those up out of the banks instead of floating down through the stream. Another project up north was on the Straight River, where they actually used helicopters to do some tree drops because they didn't want to get into the area with a bunch of machinery and tear it up. So on this site, you can see the photo on the right. There's every time you see those trees across the channel, on the inside point, they're there to aid more in sediment trapping, while on the outside bends, you see those trees there acting more as of a habitat type. And, they're not going to trap sediment on the outside bends as well as they will on the inside bends, but they're still going to act as habitat in either place. Some of the projects that we've done in the southern part of the state, one of them is on the south branch of the Whitewater River. And in this photo, you can see on the left that there's a lot of sand and sediment in the channel, and the channel is actually really wide. It's overly wide right there, which is why the sediment all drops out in that stretch. So during the project, what they did was they narrowed up the channel, and you can see that in the photo on the right, there's a riffle was created, which increases the speed of the water to help pass that sediment, but also that sediment will pass easier after they have narrowed up the channel. So we have a lot more substrate that insects will prefer to use in the photo on the right after the project was completed. Another project site at Winnebago Creek, you can see in the photo on the left that there is a gigantic island forming in the middle of this stream. One of the problems going on here was that the riffle was a grading, and then it divided the stream in two, pushing it against both of the outside banks, causing both of the outside banks to erode quite quickly. The photo on the right shows after those banks were lowered and stabilized. The photo on the left, actually, on the right side of that picture, that's a 7.5 foot high bank. And then you can see in the photo on the right to the right of where that surveyor is in the stream, you can see that those banks are less than 2 feet high after the project came through. Narrowing the stream on this section will help pass sediment once again. And another project where we actually took the high banks that you can see on the left photo with all that raw dirt against the bank. The banks were moved up to the bluff toe, and you can see on the right photo that the stream has low banks, and all that dirt was moved up by the bluff toe. And in that little photo in the center, you can actually see a hole in the center of that photo. And moving all that dirt up to the bluff toe was on purpose. We did that so we could target bank nesting birds like swallows and kingfishers. And within 1 year of that project, there was actually use by a bank swallow in that bank. Let's move along to some trout angling tips for the 2023 season. So we all know that the opener is April 15th for Catch and Keep, which is this coming weekend. Just a couple friendly tips. Make sure that you buy a license. Don't forget to do that. And also make sure that you buy a trout stamp. Those are two of the easiest things you can do for yourself so you can go out and fish without looking over your shoulder. Also, make sure that you pick up your regulations book and get to know the regulations of the stream that you'll be fishing. Double check if there are any special regulations on the stream that you choose. Quite often when you pull up at a trout stream, you'll actually see a sign like you see in the photo on the right of this slide, a big yellow sign that says special fishing regulations. Occasionally those signs do disappear, but they're typically in place. So that's one way to make sure that you're following the regulations, but just double check with your trout maps book or your fishing regulations book and make sure that you're using flies and lures on the streams that you're supposed to. And if you are fishing on a stream that allows bait, that you're using that in the right places as well. Do a little bit of pre-planning for your trip and save yourself some heartache by using Google Earth. Here's a couple examples of how I do a little bit of pre-scouting with my trout fishing trips to areas that I don't know as well. I'll use Google Earth to look at a bridge, and you might ask, well, what the heck is that going to show you? Well, that small photo on the left shows a river going underneath a bridge, and I know that that's a double wide, that's a highway bridge, that's 2 lanes, and you can see that that river is about 2 lanes wide. So that helps me understand that I'll be fishing bigger water and that I might be able to use the fly rod because it's more open, as opposed to going to a smaller stream where a fly rod might not be the best tool, but maybe a spinning rod would be a better tool to bring with me. I can also use Google Earth to measure out some distances, considering the people that you may be fishing with, maybe they can do a long distance with you, or maybe they're limited to how far they can actually walk. So on the photo on the right, I used the measure tool on Badger Creek to show that if I went and fished from bridge to bridge, it would be about a half-mile walk back to the vehicle. And you can always have a backup plan in mind. Sometimes you pull up to a bridge to go fishing and somebody's beat you there. And sometimes it's 2 or 3 vehicles have beat you there. If you go into things with a backup plan, you're more likely to have success on having a good fishing trip. Some other things to keep in mind are knowing what the weather has been doing before your trip, but also know what it's going to be doing the day of your trip, so you don't get stuck out there in a lightning storm. Knowing beforehand, though, it will help you to understand how that water might look if you had a rain event. A 1-inch rainfall versus a 5-inch rainfall is going to do very different things to the streams of that area. A smaller stream is going to clear up from muddy water a lot faster than a large stream. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that you have, in a large stream system, you have more tributaries feeding into it. So, a smaller stream just has less tributaries feeding into it, so it'll clean up faster. A couple safety tips to keep in mind are that it's always a good idea to tell someone who doesn't fish, but that you know very well, where you will be going. And that is so you don't give out your secret places to someone that's going to bombard them on you. But also keep in mind that we're approaching tick season here, and you know, we've seen it the last few days here where we had people sunburnt yesterday out on the streams while we were doing some surveys. You know, bring that sunscreen with you, and just make sure you always bring enough water. Sometimes, you know, we take for granted that we're going to be on the water, that, you know, we won't get as thirsty, but just take extra water. Something to consider also is, you know, you're probably going to be in an area that doesn't have great cell phone service. So don't rely on calling somebody to tell them where you're going to be after you get there. You know, make sure that you do that ahead of time. And I like to hide my keys underneath my bumper or in my wheel well or something. The reason is I don't want to lose them out on the stream. You know, if I stumble around and trip and fall, I don't want to lose those streams out of my pocket. So my safety measure, so I don't get stranded again in the middle of nowhere, is to make sure that I actually leave my keys behind. A couple other tips: when you're fishing trout, trout love overhead cover. Overhead cover is just basically protection for fish. You know, that can come in the form of logs, tree roots. It can be rocks that are overhanging the edge of the stream, or else rocks within the stream that they can hide behind or around. But it could also be undercut banks. You know, different parts of the season, you're going to see a lot of vegetation growing on the banks, and that vegetation will overhang a little bit, and it'll create some places for trout to hide. And, you know, another thing to consider is just deeper water. Trout are going to hide out in deeper water. Anything that is over 3 feet deep, a trout will look at that as overhead cover, kind of similarly to as if they were hiding underneath a log. So some tips for sneaking up on trout are that you really want to approach trout from a downstream fashion, because that means that you're behind them. You know, trout are always swimming upstream in streams and rivers because they have to hold their place in the water column. And you know, when you think about it, their eyes are facing forward. They are to the side, but they're still facing forward more, and they're looking at the things that are coming downstream to them that they might be able to feed on. So approaching them from behind is probably one of the best ways to fish trout, but also stay low and move slowly. If you move really slow, you're going to spook less fish. Another tip for fishing from the downstream side of the fish is that you can cast a fly above a trout, and it will actually come down with the current. It'll just trace right back to you with the water. So you can just slowly strip it back in. But also, you know, bait can come back to you with the water flow as well. So I encourage people to try to fish from the downstream side. And I have a little video here to share with folks that will show you what you can encounter if you're approaching trout from the downstream side. Now, if I were to like continue this video and walk out to the side of these fish, or if I were to approach them coming from in front of them, which I did, but I didn't put it in the video, the fish spook very easily. Once they see you, they're typically not going to bite. So enjoy this little video watching some fish feeding in southeast Minnesota.
This is the mother lode of all trout rises and hatches. Look at this. I'm not even going to try to count how many I'm seeing. But look at all those flies on the surface as well. Just trout everywhere. way up here in the top corner, look at all those flies in the shade, just bouncing all over. There's fish rising below me, just non-stop feeding. It's incredible.
So I hope that gives you all an idea of how important it is to try to sneak up on these fish from the downward side. Um, you know, one of the other tips that I would throw in there for trout fishing is that if you wear really bright colors, you're probably going to be more noticeable. So try to blend in with the scenery a little bit. Well, thank you all very much. And I just want to add that if you don't have your questions answered today, my email and my phone number are on the slide, and just jot those down, and you can always shoot me a call or a email, and if we don't get your questions answered today, I'd be happy to follow up with you at another time.
Dustin, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. We had some questions streaming in there, so yeah, and I'll try to put, maybe Amber can put Dustin's email in the chat too if we want to. We can do that. So might as well jump right into it. We might have a lot of them here today. So Michael is asking, Northeast Minnesota suffered one of the worst droughts in modern history in 2021. Streams in this area stopped flowing for over a month. What can the DNR do to study the survival of the trout population in these small brook trout streams? And are you interested in recruiting volunteers to participate?
So, Michael, my area is down in southeast Minnesota, so I just am not as familiar, and I'm really pretty new to the DNR, but there is a fella up there by the name of Nick Peterson that is a super active DNR staff member, and I would bet that Nick or even Dean Perrin would be really interested in talking with you about this topic. So I would ask you to reach out to your area fisheries offices with that question.
They're located in Duluth, right, Nick?
Duluth and Superior, I believe.
Okay. And as for the volunteers, both of us have experience with Minnesota Trout Unlimited. I think they do just an incredible job in organizing volunteers to do habitat work and help out the DNR in a lot of these projects. So if you're ever looking, no matter where in the state you are, look up Minnesota Trout Unlimited and go to the local organization. There's Hiawatha chapter down south, the Twin Cities chapter. There's, I think, 6 chapters around the state. Any habitat stuff, if you're interested in doing that, look them up and jump on their email list. So,
and the chapter up in that area is the Gitchagumi chapter.
Gitchagumi, that's right.
Gitchagumi is the Ojibwa word for Lake Superior.
There's another great question. Caitlin wrote in here, she's an aspiring angler and has zero knowledge, especially about trout fishing. Is there any resources available to find fishing mentors or classes? I got a few, but I'll let you touch on it first.
Well, Trout Unlimited is another great resource for this. Just getting in touch with the local chapter. They do put on fly tie-in seminars. They do host, veterans clinics, for fly fishing, but they also do this with kids. And there's a group in Minnesota called the Minnesota Women's Fly Fishing Group.
Yep.
And, there are a lot of resources out there, but I'll have to advocate for YouTube here as well, because anything that you want to learn these days is right there at your fingertips. Plug into YouTube, and if you're looking for fly tying or tying a leader on to your fly line, or even suggestion videos on what to purchase, but don't listen to all the people that are advocating for expensive gear, because I've fished most of my life with just kind of cheap stuff, and I fish just as well as most people I fish with. So And don't even worry about buying waders. If it's going to be summertime, just go in there and wet wade. Just wear some old junky shoes and tromp through the woods and the stream with some pants on.
Yeah, this is great. Caitlin, I put a link in the chat for Fly Fishing Women in Minnesota. It's a great group. They do a lot of women-specific classes. I know TU does. They have a great mentoring program. I forget what it's called off the top of my head now. But Minnesota Trout Unlimited, if you go on their website under education and look for their mentoring program, Foster the Outdoors and Fishing Skills programs, that's a great program also. And of course, the DNR runs Becoming an Outdoor Woman programs too, that some of those deal with fly fishing or fishing in general also. So, and of course, if you're so inclined, there's a lot of people that'll take your money to teach you to fish too. So,
And
Corvus
one
and
other tip,
other guides. But
that I'm thinking of too is that a lot of people want to get out and fly fish because, it looks artistic and peaceful and all these things. A great way to set yourself up for fly fishing is to get out and spinner fish or bait fish, because that will allow you the experience to learn how to read the water and to observe what the fish are doing. Getting out in the April, May, and June time frame when all of the hatches are going on in their height is a really good time to get out there and just observe. Even if you don't know how to cast a spinning rod, you can at least get out there and observe what the fish are doing, and that's going to show you where they like to hang out.
yeah, you can learn a lot from just walking a stream and observing for sure. So, Harlan wanted to go over ways to protect yourself from ticks. You said tick season is almost upon us. I think it's probably been here for a week or two down in the southern part of Minnesota at least. So those little things are coming out in waves. But yeah, use caution with ticks. I don't know. There's a tick resource page, I believe, in the DNR site if you want to look there and find ways to make sure you're covered up, and use permethrin or some kind of chemical if you want to go that route to protect yourself. But
and then just another side tip: when you're wearing waders, it just seems like you get so many fewer ticks. And I don't know if they just have a hard time crawling on that material, like the breathable wader material is kind of slick in a way, but I just rarely get ticks when I'm wearing waders. So I will advocate for buying waders for the tick prevention if you can afford them. But, otherwise the permethrin or permethrin, however folks want to say that word, I haven't figured out quite yet. That stuff does work well. And that's what I like to apply to my clothing. I don't like to put the stuff on my skin, like DEET and all that stuff. I'd rather just put on the permethrin.
Yep. I use that too. I actually just sprayed a couple outfits for myself and my daughter turkey hunt this weekend. So we'll be out. But Paul was asking, besides the size of the stream, what are some other reasons you would choose spinning rod over fly rod? This is probably a debate we could have for an hour or so, but.
So here's one reason I would choose to use a spinning rod. Here's a couple actually. So I'm fishing with other people, and like we're going to keep fish and eat them. I like to do a little bit of recon with a spinning rod, and I like to do that on streams that have brook trout and brown trout in them. And I like to keep brown trout to give the brook trout, the native species, a better chance. So that's when I harvest fish, I'm always harvesting brown trout. Another piece to that is that if I'm fishing water for the first time, I'm in like observation mode. So I will bring a spinning rod, and I will, use the spinning rod because I just won't know what I'm going to encounter. If I'm going to encounter a lot of overhanging trees or thick brush, And those scenarios are really difficult for a fly rod. So kind of like the investigation mode is when I love using that spinning rod, or when I'm fishing with other people that might not be fly anglers. It's like, hey, let's just go out and catch some trout, and they can typically cast a rod. So, a spinning rod's a good option. It won't frustrate them that they can't fly fish.
Yeah, fly fishing, there's purists out there that will only fly fish, but we don't need to do that or promote that either. It's anything's acceptable. I know my kids, we started out with spinning rods and moved to Takara rod, and then do a little bit of fly fishing with me now. But yeah, carrying a spinning rod is a good way to hit some of those streams and get into spots you are pretty tough with a fly rod. So
Yeah. And one thing that you can also think of is they make collapsible spinning rods that you can put inside a backpack. So if you want to investigate a stream with a fly rod, and then you learn, halfway through it, man, I'm just never going to find anywhere to cast this thing. It looked good from the bridge, but now it's just a tangle back here. Well, you could pack down your fly rod and break out that spinning rod.
I had one sitting behind me in the office. So that's a Takara rod actually, but collapsible, which is kind of nice. David asked about playing this video again. Search our YouTube channel if you want to find the videos the fastest way possible. Minnesota DNR on YouTube. Otherwise, on our list, Cassie put a link in there. So, Russ, have you tried Tenkara rod for trout fishing? We just talked about that a little bit. How does it change the way you fish? I don't know. It does change the way you fish because you can't cast. You're limited on your casting distance. So it does take a little bit more stealth and planning to do that. Have you ever tried that, Dustin?
I've never used the Tenkara rod, but what I do know is that you have to be sneaky with them because you only have so much line. So if you can fish with a Tenkara rod, you're probably a pretty sneaky person.
In a good way. In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way.
I actually know some people that are. I won't say they strictly fish with Tenkara rods, but when they fish, they like to do a little challenge. One of the groups I fish with once in a while, they'll go out and they'll pick one fly, and that's all they'll fish with for like a month. So they try to select the one fly and they try to catch fish with that one fly, and it's just kind of fun. It's bringing a lot of people go out and fish for the enjoyment of just getting outside and enjoying it. It's just another challenge to present yourself with, I guess. So. Jacob was wondering, how are habitat improvement projects prioritized? And are there different regions of the state prioritized independently from each other?
Sure. So each area office would prioritize the streams within their area. So I'll speak of the southeast part of the state here in the driftless area because that's where I work. We have two area offices that all of the trout streams are in down here, and those are the Lake City and the Lanesboro offices. And so each spring we have a meeting where each office will say, these are the projects that we would propose. And it's basically a list that's been ongoing for, decades of where they have enough easement, where the resource is, being challenged in some way. It could be that there's really high banks, there's, just a ton of old box elder and buckthorn and honeysuckle just encroaching on the stream and falling in, and that ends up tearing up the banks every high water event. So then they'll put that one on the priority list so that they can remove the vegetation and bring in the right type of vegetation that will hold the soil in place. It's very rare that we'll see a stream get a habitat improvement project that hasn't made several marks for, why it's at the top of the list, because the list is huge. The there's a lot of streams that don't even make it onto the list because there isn't enough easement, or there isn't enough, you know, I guess, resource care. You know, if it's a stream that more anglers are using, it's probably going to go higher up the list because, you know, the public is driving a lot of this. You know,
Yeah.
we are not just saying like, oh, we'd like to see more fish in that little 5-foot stream over there. We're going to choose that spot. No, they they use a lot of reason to determine that.
Great. Jacob was wondering, could you explain the reasoning behind the times of year that trout fishing is closed to all angling opportunities, including catch and release? One example would be the closure from 3/1 to 4/15.
3/1 to 4/15. That one I can't speak of.
That one might be a licensing thing, maybe. I'm not
Yeah,
positive on that one either.
I don't understand that one myself, but please don't expect that I would, because I'm not a rule maker and I'm not a, you know, conservation officer. But I can
But part of
speak
it
of the
gets into
fall.
the statute part too, because I think the opening for trout season in statute might be, it's not the 15th, it's probably the third or second Saturday of the month. So maybe it's just easier to always close it the last day of March, and then they open it on statute according to whenever that falls. So that could be the reason for that one.
Sure. Give it a 2-week break and then, you know, let people have at it again. What I will say pertains to the fall season closure. So after October 15th, trout season is closed. No more catch and release, or, you know, catch and keep ended on September 15th, roughly. And the reason that they close it down after October 15th is because they want to avoid being on private lands. Even if you're in an easement, they, you know, people are out there deer hunting, you know. And a second reason is that those fish are trying to use all their energy for spawning. And if we're catching them that time of year, it does take a lot of the energy they need for spawning. You know, they're always fighting each other to protect their red and lay their eggs there, and their, you know, their spawn there, and, you know, they're using a lot of energy. So fishing them at that time is not the best, but also preventing any like private land owner and angler issues that would result as like someone getting their deer hunt on their own property screwed up by somebody fishing.
Great. Mike was wondering, and you covered this a little bit in your presentation, I think, but there's an amazing amount of public stream access in southeast Minnesota thanks to the easement program. But it's often not exactly clear where this access actually begins or ends, or which landowner you might need to confirm with for availability. Any tips on how anglers can get better info on easement details?
So aside from the resources that I showed earlier with that online DNR trout finder link, you can use your book, or you can go into the, you know, private sector and you can buy apps like OnX or Trout Routes. Those are ways that people have built a lot more comfort with going out on streams. And those apps are basically like Google Maps, but you can download it and have the map available for you even if you don't have service. So it tracks exactly where you're at. You know, there are other map resources like Avenza maps that you can, you know, use like that, but they don't have the easements downloaded into into that app. Trout Routes and OnX, they both do have that in there. So,
And,
you know,
most of you guys do a very good job of signing stuff too. So most of them are pretty well marked. And Yes, use caution if you know you're close to the end of it or think you are. It's better to just, you know what, I'm not going to proceed past there because I'm not positive on it, and go that route too.
And I did typically avoid the discussion today about legalities of, when we don't have an easement, are we legal just by being in the stream? I'm just not the person to ask those questions. The conservation officers truly are. And on the website, if you type into that search bar conservation officer, you can get to a map that's interactive that leads you to the contact information for that officer of your area. And they're really the best resource for coaching you through staying legal when there isn't an easement involved.
Harlan put something in there, and this is one of the reasons I like fishing the first, few weeks of the trout fishing opener, is the challenges of stinging nettles. So there's one thing about going earlier, the grasses and the stinging nettles and all that stuff are smaller, so I don't have to worry about them as much.
Yeah. And the parsnip, like you get midsummer and the parsnip's going to get you, and the stinging nettles are too. The hatches really slow down midsummer too. We have just a major boom of hatches going on from April 1st until the end of June, with these chironomids, these little tiny midge species. And then it goes into caddisflies and mayflies and stoneflies. It's kind of neat to see these things. And I would advocate anybody that doesn't even know much about trout fishing to just go out into a trout stream and grab a rock off the bottom and turn it over and just look at all the different critters that are crawling around on that rock. They won't bite you, but there's a lot of different critters.
That's definitely a great tip, and that's, in fly fishing, that's what we're trying to mimic, I guess, these bugs, these macroinvertebrates that are under the water. So we just got just a minute left. Jeff did ask about if the DNR is still working on finding and purchasing new easements. I think that's a continuous project.
Yeah, there's funding that gets brought in every year for that. Each area fisheries office actually has somebody that specializes in their easement program. So, down here in Southeast, we have the Lanesboro area fisheries office and then the Lake City fisheries office. So you could always contact me if you live in a different area, and I'll help you find a area fisheries office staff member to reach out to if you want to sell an easement.
That's great. I think with that, we're out of time. So thank you, Dustin, for coming on and joining us today and sharing the knowledge. I think I've said this before. Minnesota is one of the probably premier spots between the East Coast and Western states for trout fishing that a lot of people don't know about. And it's just a great place with a lot of great fishing opportunities and public opportunities. So we live in a great state for fishing, that's for sure. So
good luck to everybody this season.
Yeah, thanks. Good luck, everybody. I hope to see everybody back next week. We're talking about the Peregrine Falcon story next week on the Moss program. Until then, stay safe outside and have fun. We'll talk to you soon.